There's something peaceful about camping alone. No traffic, no city lights, just you, the trees, and the quiet breathing of the wilderness around you. For many people, that silence is exactly what makes camping so relaxing. But sometimes, the silence isn't really silence. Sometimes when you're deep in the woods, far away from civilization, you begin to notice things that shouldn't be there. Footsteps that don't belong to animals. Voices that seem too close, even though no one should be around for miles. A tent zipper moving slowly in the middle of the night. And the worst part about camping alone is that when something goes wrong, there's no one there to help you. The following stories come from people who decided to spend a night alone in the wilderness and realized too late that they weren't actually alone. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into a collection of true camping alone horror stories. Real experiences shared by people who thought they were going to enjoy a quiet night in nature. Each story is told from the perspective of the person who experienced it, and while some of them might sound unbelievable, they all share one terrifying detail. Every one of these people was completely alone, or at least they thought they were. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into the woods. Story 1. The footsteps around my tent. A few years ago, I decided to go camping alone in a national forest about 3 hours away from my city. I had done solo camping trips before, and honestly I preferred them. No talking, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional owl somewhere in the distance. The place I picked was pretty remote. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near a hiking trail that backpackers sometimes used. The closest town was about 40 minutes away, and once the sun started going down, the area became completely silent. I set up my small tent right near the tree line and started a small fire to cook dinner. Everything felt normal. I ate, listened to music for a while, and eventually the temperature started dropping, so I crawled into my sleeping bag. At first, the night was exactly what I expected. Quiet, peaceful. Around midnight, though, I woke up suddenly. Not because of a sound, but because of a feeling. You know that strange, instinctive feeling when something around you has changed? Like your brain notices something before you consciously do. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, listening. At first I heard nothing, just the soft rustling of leaves from the wind. Then I heard it, a slow crunching sound. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but definitely there. Crunch, pause, crunch, and they were moving around my tent. My first thought was that it had to be a deer or some other animal. That wasn't unusual out there, but the more I listened, the more I realized something was wrong. Animals don't walk like that. These steps were slow, careful, deliberate, and they stopped every time I shifted inside the tent. I held my breath and stayed completely still. The footsteps moved closer. I could hear them just a few feet away now, right outside the thin nylon wall of the tent. Whoever or whatever was out there slowly walked around the entire tent, circling it once, then twice. I remember staring at the fabric wall, expecting to see a shadow appear, but nothing did. Then the footsteps stopped completely. For about 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. And then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A human cough. Not loud, just a small, quiet cough, like someone trying not to be heard. At that moment, every hair on my body stood up. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead for hours, and the nearest campsite was miles away. I grabbed the small camping knife I kept next to my sleeping bag and sat there without moving. After another minute, the footsteps started again, but this time they were walking away. Slowly, the crunching sounds moved deeper into the woods until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so much that I struggled to fold the tent properly. That's when I noticed something. In the dirt around my campsite were footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They circled my tent multiple times. But what bothered me most was where they came from. There were no tracks leading toward the campsite, only the ones circling my tent and then walking back into the forest. To this day, I still don't understand how someone could have approached my tent without leaving a single footprint in the dirt. Story 2. The flashlight in the trees. Last summer, I went on a solo camping trip in a forest area in northern Oregon. It was supposed to be a quick overnight trip, just to disconnect from everything for a while. The place I chose was far away from the main campsites. You had to hike about 2 miles down a dirt trail to reach a clearing near a small lake. I liked the spot because it was quiet and hardly anyone went there. When I arrived in the afternoon, I didn't see another person anywhere. I set up my tent close to the water and spent the evening fishing and cooking some instant noodles over a small stove. It was actually a really nice night. The sky was clear, and you could see thousands of stars reflecting on the lake. Around 11 p.m., I crawled into my tent and started drifting off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to a strange glow outside the tent. At first, I thought it was the moon shining through the trees, but the light was moving. Slowly, back and forth. I sat up and looked through the small mesh window of the tent. That's when I saw it. A flashlight beam moving through the trees about 50 yards away. Someone was walking through the forest. That alone wasn't too weird. Maybe another camper had arrived late and was trying to find a place to set up. But something about the way the light moved felt wrong. It wasn't heading toward the clearing. It was circling the edge of the forest, like the person was watching the campsite from a distance. I kept watching the beam move between the trees. Then suddenly it stopped. The light was pointing directly at my tent. I froze. For several seconds, the flashlight stayed perfectly still, shining straight at me. Whoever was holding it had clearly seen my campsite. Then the light turned off. Just like that, the entire forest went dark again. I waited for footsteps or movement, but there was nothing. Just the quiet sound of the lake water and the wind. I didn't know if the person had left or if they were still standing there in the darkness. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the tree line. Around 3 in the morning, I finally heard something. A branch snapping, but it came from much closer this time, maybe 20 feet from my tent. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The moment the beam hit the trees, I saw something move. A person. They were standing between 2 trees, partially hidden in the darkness. The light only hit them for a second before they turned and ran. I heard them crashing through the brush, moving deeper into the woods. I didn't leave my tent until morning. When the sun came up, I walked to the spot where I'd seen the figure. The ground there was muddy from the lake water, and in the mud were clear footprints. Bare footprints. No shoes, just human feet walking in circles around the edge of my campsite. Story 3, the car that shouldn't be there. A couple of years ago, I decided to try winter camping for the first time. I'm not an expert camper, but I had enough experience to feel confident doing it alone. I picked a forest area in Colorado that allowed dispersed camping along a long dirt road that ran through the mountains. It was early December, and the place was almost completely empty. Snow covered most of the ground, and the temperature was already dropping below freezing when I arrived. The road itself was quiet and isolated. I drove for almost 30 minutes without seeing another car. Eventually, I found a small clearing just off the road and decided that would be my campsite for the night. The sun was already setting, so I worked quickly to set up my tent and get a small fire going. Once everything was ready, I sat by the fire eating canned soup and enjoying the silence of the mountains. By the time I finished eating, the sky had turned completely dark. There were no lights anywhere. No houses, no other campers, nothing. Just darkness and snow. I stayed by the fire for another hour before deciding to turn in. I made sure the fire was completely out and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. I lay there listening, still half asleep. Then I realized what I was hearing. An engine. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine was running. That immediately felt strange. The road I had driven in on wasn't popular at all, especially during winter, and it was probably around 2 in the morning. I sat up and listened carefully. The engine wasn't moving. It sounded like a car that was just idling somewhere. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked outside. The forest was dark, but I could see faint light reflecting off the snow from farther down the road. Headlights. There was a car parked maybe 200 feet away. At first, I assumed someone else had just come to camp late. But the weird thing was that the car wasn't near any campsite. It was just sitting on the road, and the headlights were off. Only the engine was running. I watched for a few minutes, expecting someone to step out of the vehicle. But no one did. The car just sat there in the darkness. After about 10 minutes, the engine finally turned off, and the entire forest went silent again. I figured whoever was had gone to sleep inside the car, so I zipped the tent closed and tried to go back to sleep. But about 20 minutes later, I heard something else. Footsteps, crunching slowly through the snow, and they were getting closer. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped just outside my tent. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then someone lightly tapped the side of the tent. Just once. A soft knock. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. After a few seconds, the footsteps started again, slowly walking away from the tent. I waited until I could no longer hear them. When I finally looked outside again, the car was gone. The road was empty. I barely slept the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and walked over to the road. In the snow near my campsite, there were two sets of tracks. One set led from the road to my tent, and the other set led back to the road. But what bothered me was the direction of the footprints. Whoever walked to my tent had come from the opposite direction of where the car had been parked, which meant that someone had already been walking through the forest before that car even arrived. Story 4. Someone touched my tent. This happened when I was camping alone in a state forest in Pennsylvania. I had taken a few days off work and decided to spend a quiet weekend hiking and camping. The area I chose had a few official campsites, but I decided to hike a little farther and set up in a more secluded spot near a small creek. It was the kind of place where you could go hours without seeing another person. I arrived in the afternoon, set up my tent, and spent most of the evening exploring the nearby trails. By the time I got back to camp, it was already getting dark. I cooked some food, listened to the sound of the water from the creek, and eventually crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. For the first couple of hours, everything was quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The forest was silent, but something felt off. I stayed perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening carefully. That's when I heard a faint rustling sound outside. It sounded like someone walking slowly through the leaves. My first thought was that it was just an animal. Raccoons and deer were common in that area, but the sound kept getting closer and closer until it stopped right next to my tent. I could hear breathing, not loud, but definitely human breathing. My heart started pounding. I stared at the thin wall of the tent, trying to see if there was a shadow outside, but the moonlight wasn't strong enough. Then something happened that I will never forget. A hand pressed against the side of the tent. From the outside, I could see the shape of the fingers pushing against the fabric. Whoever was out there slowly dragged their hand along the side of the tent, almost like they were feeling the material. I froze. I didn't speak. I didn't move. The hand disappeared. Then I heard footsteps again, slowly circling the tent. After a minute, the footsteps stopped near the entrance of the tent. I could hear someone standing there. Then the zipper moved. Just a little, maybe an inch. The sound was quiet, but unmistakable. Someone had grabbed the zipper from outside. I immediately shouted as loud as I could. "Hey!" The reaction was instant. Whoever was outside sprinted away into the forest. I heard branches snapping and leaves crunching as they ran deeper into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night holding a flashlight and my knife. When the sun came up, I stepped outside and looked around the campsite. There were footprints everywhere. But the thing that still creeps me out the most was the size of them. They were much smaller than I expected, almost like they belonged to a child. Except the footprints were spaced far apart, like someone running very fast. Story 5. The Whistle in the Forest. This happened about 4 years ago when I went on a solo camping trip in a forest in Northern California. I had been to the area before with friends, but this was my first time going alone. The place was known for being extremely quiet. The campsite I picked was about a mile off the main trail, deep enough that you couldn't hear any road noise or see any lights at night. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted. The first day went perfectly. I hiked most of the afternoon, set up my tent near a small clearing, and spent the evening sitting by a small campfire. When the fire burned out, the forest became unbelievably dark. I crawled into my tent around midnight and fell asleep pretty quickly. Sometime later, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I stayed still and listened. Then I heard it again. A whistle. It was short and soft, almost like someone trying to get the attention of a friend from far away. I sat up in my sleeping bag. The whistle came again a few seconds later. 2 quick notes, then silence. My first thought was that another camper must be somewhere nearby, maybe trying to locate someone they were camping with. But the longer I listened, the stranger it felt, because the whistle kept repeating. Every few minutes. Always the same pattern. 2 short notes, then silence. What made it worse was that the sound seemed to move. At first it sounded far away, then closer, then far again, like whoever was whistling was walking through the forest. Eventually the sound got close enough that I could tell it was somewhere behind my tent, probably no more than 50 feet away. At that point I grabbed my flashlight and sat there, listening carefully. The whistle came again. 2 quick notes, but this time it sounded much closer, maybe 20 feet away. My heart started racing. If it was another camper, why weren't they saying anything? Why were they just whistling? I unzipped the tent slightly and shined my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just dark trunks and moving branches. The forest looked empty. I zipped the tent shut again and waited. A few minutes passed. Then the whistle came again, right next to my tent. 2 notes, clear and loud. I immediately turned on the flashlight and opened the tent door fully. The beam of light scanned across the clearing. Nothing was there. No person, no animal, just trees and shadows. The forest was completely silent again. After that, the whistling stopped. I stayed awake for hours, expecting it to start again, but it never did. The next morning, I packed up my gear and started hiking back toward the main trail. About half a mile away, I found another campsite near the trail. 2 hikers were there making breakfast. I asked them if they had heard anyone whistling during the night. They both looked at each other for a moment. Then one of them asked me something that made my stomach drop. Did it sound like 2 short notes? I nodded. The guy stared at me for a second before saying something that still creeps me out. We heard it too, but it was coming from the opposite direction, away from where you were camping. Story 6. The man who watched me all night. Last fall, I went camping alone in a national park in Utah. It was during the off-season, so the campground was almost completely empty. There were maybe 3 other campers scattered across the entire area. I picked a spot near the edge of the campground, close to a rocky hill that overlooked the valley. The place felt peaceful and quiet, and I spent the evening taking photos of the sunset and cooking dinner over a small portable stove. Everything felt normal, until later that night. Around midnight, I stepped out of my tent to use the restroom building nearby. The moon was bright enough that I didn't even need a flashlight. As I walked across the campground, I noticed something strange. Someone was standing on top of the hill near my campsite. At first I thought it might be another camper stargazing or something. But the person was completely still, just standing there, facing toward the campground. I shrugged it off and continued to the restroom building. When I came back a few minutes later, the person was still there, in the exact same spot, not moving. I walked back to my tent and glanced up the hill again. The figure was still standing there. I couldn't see their face clearly because of the distance, but I could tell they were looking directly toward my campsite. That's when it started to feel weird. Most people camping out there stayed near their tents at night. Standing alone on a hill in the dark for that long just seemed odd. I crawled into my tent and tried to ignore it, but something made me look outside again about 20 minutes later. The figure was still there, in the exact same place. I started getting this uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. I checked the time on my phone. It was around 1 a.m. For the next hour, I kept glancing outside every few minutes. And every time I looked, the man was still there, standing on the hill, watching the campground, watching my tent. At around 2:30 a.m., I finally got tired enough that I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up in the morning, the hill was empty. The man was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had overreacted the night before. But when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt behind my campsite. They led up the hill, but there were no footprints leading down. I followed the tracks halfway up the hill before they disappeared among the rocks. When I reached the top, I looked down at the campground. From that spot, you could see directly into my tent area. Clear as day. Someone had been standing there all night, watching me. And the weirdest part was that I never saw them leave. Story 7. The tent that was already there. About 2 years ago, I went on a solo camping trip in a forest area in Washington State. The plan was simple. Hike a few miles into the woods, set up camp near a river, and spend the night alone. The trail wasn't very popular, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted quiet. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing that looked perfect for camping. The ground was flat, there was a small stream nearby, and the trees around it created a natural barrier from the wind. But as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I noticed something strange. There was already a tent there. It was set up near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a few trees. At first, I assumed someone else had just arrived before me. That happens sometimes on trails like that. But the tent looked old. Not damaged, just strange. The fabric was faded and dirty, and the shape of it looked like an older style tent you don't really see much anymore. I looked around for a moment, expecting the owner to appear, but there was no one there. No backpack, no campfire, no gear, just the tent. I even called out a couple of times. Hello. Nothing. The forest was completely silent. I thought about leaving and finding another spot, but I had already hiked pretty far, and the clearing was perfect. I figured maybe the owner was out hiking and would return later. So I set up my own tent on the opposite side of the clearing. A couple of hours passed. The sun started going down. Still no sign of the other camper. At that point, I started feeling a little uneasy. Most people wouldn't leave their tent unattended for that long, especially in a remote place like that. I walked over to the tent to take a closer look. The zipper was closed, but the tent looked like it hadn't been moved in a long time. Leaves had collected around the edges, and the fabric felt stiff when I lightly touched it. I called out again. Hey, anyone here? Still nothing. Curiosity got the better of me. I slowly pulled the zipper open a few inches. Inside the tent was nothing. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no supplies, just bare ground. It looked like someone had set up the tent and then left it completely empty. That alone was strange enough, but what really bothered me was the smell. A strong, stale smell filled the inside of the tent. Not like garbage, more like something that had been sitting there for a very long time. I zipped the tent back up and walked away. At that point, I decided I would stay the night, but leave early in the morning. Once darkness fell, the clearing became very quiet. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent when I heard something that made me sit up immediately. The sound of a zipper. Not mine. The other tent. I stayed completely still. A few seconds later, I heard movement. Fabric shifting, like someone inside the tent had just sat up. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened my tent door. The beam of light landed directly on the other tent. It was still zipped shut, completely still. No movement. I stared at it for a full minute. Nothing happened. Eventually, I went back inside my tent, but I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and left. But before I walked away from the clearing, I looked at the other tent one last time. The zipper was open, just a few inches, exactly the same way I had opened it earlier that evening. Story 8. The Voice Near the Lake. A few summers ago, I went camping alone near a lake in northern Minnesota. It was a quiet area that allowed primitive camping, meaning there were no official campsites or park rangers nearby. Just forest, water, and miles of wilderness. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the lakeshore and spent the evening fishing and cooking dinner. By the time it got dark, the entire area was silent except for insects and the occasional splash of fish in the water. I went to sleep around 11 p.m. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the sound of someone talking. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. A voice. It was faint, but definitely human. It sounded like someone speaking softly near the lake. I sat up and listened carefully. The voice continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Then it started again. The strange thing was that I couldn't understand any of the words. It wasn't loud enough, but it sounded like someone having a quiet conversation. I checked my phone. It was 2:17 a.m. I unzipped the tent slightly and looked outside. The lake was calm and empty. No lights, no boats, no other campers. But the voice came again. This time it sounded closer, right near the shoreline. I stepped outside the tent and walked a few steps toward the water. Hello, I called out. The voice stopped instantly. The entire area went silent. I stood there for about a minute listening. Nothing. Eventually, I went back into the tent. About 10 minutes later, the voice started again. But this time it sounded different. It sounded like my voice. Not exactly the same, but close. Like someone mimicking the way I had said hello. I didn't leave the tent again that night. The voice stopped shortly before sunrise. The next morning, I walked down to the shoreline. The sand there was soft and damp, so footprints should have been obvious. But there was nothing. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there. Just my own footprints leading back to the tent. Story 9. The campsite that wasn't empty. Last year, I went camping in a national forest in Arizona. I arrived late in the afternoon and found a campsite that looked completely empty. There was an old fire pit and a few logs for sitting, but no tents or vehicles anywhere. Perfect. I parked my car nearby, set up my tent, and spent the evening watching the sunset over the mountains. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned off my lantern. About an hour later, I heard something. A cough. It came from somewhere behind my tent. I froze. I listened carefully. A few seconds later, another cough. Human. Not far away. I sat up in the darkness. Hello. I called. No answer. I turned on my flashlight and stepped outside. The campsite looked empty. But then I noticed something in the trees about 30 feet away. Another tent. I hadn't seen it earlier because it was hidden behind thick bushes. The tent was dark, but it was definitely there. Feeling a little embarrassed, I walked closer and called out again. Hey, sorry. I didn't realize someone else was camping here. No response. The tent didn't move. The zipper was slightly open. My flashlight beam hit the inside. The tent was empty. I stood there confused, because the cough I had heard definitely came from that direction. I went back to my tent and tried to sleep. But around 3 a.m., I heard the cough again. This time, right outside my tent. Story 10. I wasn't the only one camping alone. This happened during a solo camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. I had hiked about 4 miles off the main trail and set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. It was late fall, so there weren't many hikers around. The first part of the night was quiet. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking past my tent. Slow, steady footsteps. Crunching leaves. I assumed another hiker had arrived late and was passing through. But the footsteps didn't continue down the trail. They stopped, right next to my tent. I stayed completely still. After a few seconds, the footsteps moved again, but now they were circling the tent. Slowly, one full circle, then another. I grabbed my flashlight and suddenly turned it on. The light hit a man standing just a few feet away. He looked surprised for a split second. Then he smiled. Sorry, he said calmly. I thought you were asleep. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. Are you camping nearby? I asked. He pointed into the darkness. Yeah, just over there. Then he walked away. I heard his footsteps disappear into the forest. The next morning, I packed my gear and decided to leave early. As I walked down the trail, I passed every campsite along the way. There were only 3, and all of them were empty. I never found the place where that man said he was camping. Ultra. Those were 10 true camping alone horror stories from people who went into the wilderness expecting peace and quiet, but found something far more unsettling. Sometimes the scariest experiences aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just another person somewhere in the darkness, watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true scary stories just like these. And let me know in the comments, which story disturbed you the most? And if you've ever had a creepy experience while camping alone, share it. Because you never know who else might have been out there in the woods listening.